listen-only mode.
Well, hello and welcome to today's Vermont Hops Power Hour webinar. My name is Deb Haliba and I am helping out our hops team at the University of Vermont Extension Northwest Crops and Soils program with this webinar series. And so before we jump in, I just wanted to provide a few quick housekeeping notes. First, we are very grateful to the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, SARE, for providing funding support for this project. We are recording the webinar today and we'll provide the URL to the recording later this week. It's also will be available on our YouTube channel. Today's webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes, so Heather Darby will be giving a presentation on soil fertility in the Hopyard, and then we will be also asking a couple of quick poll questions, and Scott Lewins will be wrapping up today's session with some results of our first goScout survey. All right, I will now turn the mic over to the UVM Extension Agronomic and Soil Specialist, Dr. Heather Darby. Welcome, Heather.
Great. Thanks, Deb. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, so I'll get started. Well, welcome everybody. Great to have you here today. It's a rainy day in Vermont, I hear, but I'm actually down in Washington, D.C. giving this webinar. It's also raining here. So today we're going to focus on soil fertility during the power hour. Some of you may have already fertilized your hops or started to fertilize your hops, and others of us are just getting ready to do so. So we'd go through what we currently know about hop fertility and get you set up to start fertilizing. All right, so fertility management. Now, if you're getting ready to plant a new hop yard, you know, this is really critical. I tell people this all the time. Please make sure you take a soil test before you put those plants in the ground. Once they're in the ground, it becomes a little more difficult to make major corrections to soil fertility, especially pH. So if you're getting ready to plant, take the time to figure out the soil nutrients by taking a soil test, which we'll talk about in a minute, so that some major issues can be rectified if they exist before you put the plants in the ground. So for hops really do perform the best with a pH above 6, but you know, hops have been shown to grow in pHs below 6. 5.7 I think is probably the minimum you'd want to go. And you could, of course, raise hops up, you know, to around a 7 pH, but maximum productivity really is in that 6.2 to 6.5 range. Liming takes time. So again, if you haven't put the hops in the ground, you'd want to definitely be liming at least a season before planting, but if that's not possible, just get the lime in the ground before you put the plants down. Okay, so again, taking soil tests is really important with hops, not just when you get started, but on a seasonal basis to check where some of your nutrient levels are, especially phosphorus and potassium, also zinc levels, boron levels, magnesium levels, so the basic nutrient profile, so that you can figure out what to fertilize. Hops do have deep rooting systems, and it is recommended that you sample to 2 to 3 foot depth in established hop yards. But if you're just getting going, again, about 1 foot to 2 feet, if you can, would be a good zone for sampling. Depending on the size of your yard, usually we take, you know, 5 to 10 cores per acre. But how much you sample is usually dependent on variation in your hop yard and really what you're comfortable with. For our hop yard, which is roughly an acre, we generally take 10 to 20 soil probes per bed, so where the hops are actually growing, kind of sampling near the hill. Now, of course, if you're hearing this and you've already fertilized, what you don't want to do is go in and now take a soil sample and get fertilizer in the actual sample. So if you have already fertilized, you might want to wait till this fall to take a soil test so you don't get fertilizer skewing the results. All right. So again, how big of a sample you decide to take, how and where you take that sample really depends on, you know, your yard, how you want to split the yard up. If you want, you know, if you have a portion of your yard that has maybe a wetter soil type or a sandier soil type, you may want to sample each of those separate, or you may just go with one sample, but that's really up to you. Sampling with a soil core is the easiest. There was a photo of that in this picture. You can see it's a kind of a long probe that's easier to push into a ground, and it gives you a deeper and better sample than just using a shovel. I did say that you want to try to sample relatively deep, or as deep as you can, so a soil probe actually works best for that. When you're taking these samples, you take those cores, you put them in a plastic bucket. We prefer plastic instead of metal so that you don't get actual elements in your soil test. Put all of those cores into a bucket. You mix that sample up, and then you take a subsample, roughly about a cup of soil, and put it in. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, we can hear you. You did beep out for just a second. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just got a little sign that I went out. I'm not sure why, but if it happens again, I'll call in. So then you want to take about 1 cup of soil and put it into a plastic Ziploc, fill out the soil testing form that should come with your kit, and send that off to the lab. Usually it takes about a week to 2 weeks to get the analysis back. There's a couple of local labs if you live in the Northeast. So there's the University of Vermont Testing Laboratory, which most people are familiar with, and then there's also Dairy One or Agro One that's out of New York. Both of those soil test labs will provide hop-specific recommendations. And if you need more information on this, please feel free to contact myself, and I can, send you a soil test kit and more information if needed. Okay. Here's a soil test report that you might get back. Most soil test reports, they look a little bit different, but they have the same basic information on them. Usually it's somewhat overwhelming for people that aren't familiar with soil tests, but I'll just go through this quickly so that you can read it once you get it back. Up on the top here, it shows you the soil pH. You can see it's 6.3 on this sample, so good for hops. The available phosphorus, it lists this in parts per million, is 1.5 parts per million. And if you look across here, it tells you that that's considered low by Vermont soil test standards. And you can see here the potassium levels are 83 parts per million, and that's considered a medium level through Vermont soil test standards. We also have magnesium reported here, 176 parts per million, and you can see that's considered optimum. The other nutrients here are aluminum, calcium, zinc is considered low in this soil. And all of these nutrients will play into the actual recommendation that you get for your crop. Okay? There's also a couple other items to be noted here, which is the cation exchange capacity, which essentially is the ability for your soil to hold on to positively charged nutrients. Those are called cations. So again, the cation exchange capacity, the CEC, is the ability for your soil to hold on to positively charged nutrients. What are positively charged nutrients? Calcium, potassium, magnesium, ammonium, sodium. Those are all nutrients that your soil holds on to and keeps from leaching into the groundwater. Okay, so essentially this shows you the nutrient storage capacity of your soils. And what we're looking for here is usually a value between 10 and 12. If you have a light textured soil, it's bound to be lower than that. So if you have a sandy soil, and if you have a heavier textured soil, it will tend to be higher than that, a clay soil. Clay has negative charge, Sand has no charge. Okay. It also shows you the organic matter level on a soil test, and this soil is 5.3% organic matter. Okay, so then generally on your soil test, it will take these numbers here, the parts per million of the soil nutrients, and then it'll generate recommendations for the crop that you've identified that you will be growing. This isn't a hop one, I apologize for that, but you can see the same basic information. So what this is saying is that if you have this soil test with these level of nutrients in your soil, this is the recommendation of nutrients needed to grow the crop. So this crop requires no lime, 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 60 pounds of phosphorus, and 100 pounds of potassium, and no magnesium. All right, so soil tests will be very helpful to you, especially as it relates to phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and also zinc and boron for certain crops. All right, now one of the things you probably don't see here is the parts per million of nitrogen. And nitrogen's a very hard nutrient to measure in soils because it's so dynamic, which means that the biology in your soil is constantly changing the form of nitrogen. And so nitrogen recommendations for hops and for grass and for most other crops are based on crop removal rates. Okay, and we'll talk about that more. There we go. All right, so again, here's the pH, soil pH and nutrient availability. So like I said, most crops in general like to grow in slightly acidic soils. So this kind of 6.2 to 6.5 range. Hops are no different. The reason that crops grow best at those pH ranges is because that's also when nutrients are most available. So you can see in this pH range, sort of slightly acidic, that's when most nutrients are available to your crop. And you can see as the pH goes down, most nutrients become less available and some become more available. Okay. And so that's why we like to have that pH range right here. Okay. If you need lime, there's lots of different sources of lime available. The most common is calcium carbonate. That's what most of you will be using. It's very effective at neutralizing acidity. If you need magnesium, I would also recommend using dolomitic lime instead of calcium carbonate because it has magnesium in it. But as you can see, there's lots of liming agents available to you. Most liming agents are also considered certified organic if you're growing organic hops. All right, so again, add the lime in the fall so that it has time to react in the soil. Try to correct soil pHs prior to planting if possible because mixing it into the ground will enable it to react faster. But pH is very important from a nutrient availability perspective, so you want to make sure that your pH is optimum for growing hops. All right, so now let's get in to nutrient uptake. So this is a graph from Oregon State that shows nitrogen in particular and nitrogen uptake in hops throughout the growing season. So what I want you to pay attention to, is this sharp uptake, okay, or slope. And what this shows is that the most nitrogen is taken up, okay, between, and this is in Oregon, between the 10th of June, so the first part of June, till right about mid-July. Sorry about that. All right. So, and then the level that the crop needs and is taking up levels off sharply, which means essentially once you get to about the middle of July, the crop is no longer going to be removing nitrogen from the soil. So what does this tell you? It means that if you're adding nitrogen to grow this crop, you want to make sure that the crop has adequate nitrogen basically between the end of May, right, into the very beginning part of July. That's what we call the critical uptake period. So you want to make sure that basically almost all of your nitrogen is applied and available to that hop crop between the end of May, right, and very early July. If you're putting on a lot of nitrogen after that time, it's just going to waste. Okay, if you put the majority of that nitrogen on, right, at the end of June, you've also missed a big part of this critical uptake period. Okay, so yields will suffer from that. So during this critical uptake time, you want to make sure that there's adequate nitrogen and other nutrients for your crops. This doesn't matter, you know, it doesn't matter what crop you're growing. Every crop has this critical uptake period where a mass amount of nutrients are needed to basically grow that crop, the vegetative portion, and get that crop set up for reproduction essentially. And once you start moving through those reproductive stages, the amount of nutrients you need declines. Okay, all crops are like that. And for hops, that critical period is, again, sort of the end of May up through mid-July. All right? So this is really important when you're thinking about when to fertilize, how much fertilizer or how many nutrients the crop needs. You need to be paying attention to the critical uptake period. All right? Okay, so depending on the variety, the amount of nutrients you need will vary, and really that has to do with primarily with yields. So the higher a variety yields, sometimes, most of the times, there's more plant material, more biomass, and more nutrients being removed from the soil, which means you got to fertilize them more, okay? So if you're producing more, they need more nutrients. So if you have a very high yielding crop, it's going to remove more nutrients than if you have a low yielding crop. All right, so overall, your plant, your hop plant as a whole is 3% nitrogen, okay, 2% potassium, and half a percent phosphorus. So you see the plant needs a lot of nitrogen, quite a bit of potassium, and not very much phosphorus. That doesn't mean neglect phosphorus. It just means that you don't need as much of it as nitrogen and potassium. Other really important nutrients that have been listed in the literature are boron and zinc. Now in the Northeast, boron deficiencies are very common and zinc deficiencies are very common. They're anions, which means they're easily lost in the soil. And so in general, I do tell people, especially on the old forest grounds, spodosols, that they should be adding boron and zinc regularly at very small amounts. Okay, so let's just do some basic math. And again, I'm happy to share these slides with folks if you want them. But this just gives you a gauge of what your crop is actually removing from the soil. All right, so if you're producing 5,000 pounds of dry matter, not wet matter, but dry matter per acre, all right, this is whole plant, so this is the vines and the cones, then that hop crop is removing 150 pounds of nitrogen, that's 3% of 5,000, 100 pounds of potassium, and 25 pounds of phosphorus, okay? So if you've been neglecting adding potassium to your soils, you should relook at your fertility program because hops need a lot of potassium. If you're on very light textured soils, you probably need to be adding potassium every year, right? Most of us have just really been focused on nitrogen, and hops do need a lot of nitrogen, but they also need other nutrients as well. Okay, so you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, how do I know how much biomass I have out there? I'm not taking these plants down and weighing the whole thing. We do that at UVM, and I would say this is the range that we see, but you're not going to do that at home. So how can you come up with this information from a very different angle? You can do that by knowing how many cones you're harvesting. What's the weight of your cones, okay? So the cones themselves make up 1/3 to 1/2 of the dry matter per acre, all right? So if we have 5,000 pounds and we're saying half of that is cone dry matter, then we know that the cones are removing 75 pounds of nitrogen, 50 pounds of potassium, and 12.5 pounds of phosphorus. So if you're actually just putting all the green matter back on your yard, except for the cones, then this is the actual nutrient removal rate, 75, 50, and 12.5 pounds, okay? Now you can also tell from this that you could back calculate. So if you know that your cones are yielding a certain amount, and you know that that's half of the dry matter that's coming off of the yard, then you just double this number to know how many nutrients total you're removing from the yard, okay? I'm hoping that makes sense to folks. I can't hear anybody, so we're assuming it does. So if you have a first-year hop yard, let's go through this exercise. Usually a first-year hop yard is not going to produce a whole lot, and we actually measured our dry matter from our first year hop yard, and this is what we got. So there were 1,750 pounds of dry matter per acre, and so our crop removal rate was 55 pounds of nitrogen, 35 pounds of potassium, and 9 pounds of phosphorus. This is pretty close to what you see in other publications, that in a first year hop yard you need roughly 75 pounds of nitrogen, okay? All right, so again, you should know your cone yields. And again, just back calculating, if you have 1,000 pounds of dry cones per acre, and you know that that's roughly 30 to 50% of the total weight you have out in that field, then you can figure out how many nutrients as a whole are being removed from the yard, right? So if you have 1,000 pounds of cones, then that's 2,000 pounds of the dry matter, which means you've removed 60 pounds of N per acre, right? So it's just calculating it backwards. Now, one of the things I should know is, let's say you're getting 200 pounds of dry cones per acre, and you calculate backwards to figure out what your nitrogen removal rate is, which let's just say it's 20 pounds of N or 30 pounds of N. Now, you want higher yields than 200 pounds per acre. So you want to be fertilizing for higher yields. So if you want to achieve 1,000 pounds of dry cones per acre, then you need to be fertilizing 60 to 90 pounds of N to be removed from the soil, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about nitrogen. You want to base your nitrogen rate on yields. Now, you can base it on your current yields, especially if you're happy with those. But if you're not, you may want to project a yield that you're looking for, so 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds, and be fertilizing for that yield, right? So 3% of that biomass is nitrogen. So figure out what the yield is that you want, and 3% of that should be added in the form of N, okay? Now, this means that the nitrogen rate per acre can span anywhere from, 60 to a couple pounds of N per acre, okay? It really depends on your yield goals, which for most of us are pretty high. But the other thing that you need to consider is potential loss, okay? So in the Northeast, we get a lot of rain. Sometimes we get cold weather. All of those things can cause nitrogen losses, right? So nitrogen use efficiency in plants is fairly low. So really, if you add 200 pounds of N per acre, you could lose 50% of that from rain, okay? So you have to be planning for some nutrient loss. Now, a year like this, so far, it's been really wet. If you put your 200 pounds of N, I'll guarantee that a lot of that will be lost from leaching, immobilization, and will not be available to your hops. Okay, so you have to be thinking about these things. Okay, I know how much nitrogen I need, but when am I going to apply it? How much am I going to apply at one time? And if I apply a lot at one time and then we get rain, should I go back in and apply more, right? And that's really going to be determined by the weather. So let's just look at the nitrogen cycle quickly, because I want you to understand that nitrogen can be lost in a number of different ways. So right here you can see nitrogen being added to the soil by organic matter. So if you're adding compost or manure as an example, or through fertilizers like urea, UAN, ammonium sulfate, things like that, right? Now, all fertilizers, most of them anyway, and manure or other organic matter get converted to the ammonium form of nitrogen, okay, NH4+. And you can see it has this plus sign, so it's a cation, and it gets hung up on your soil, right? So it doesn't leach necessarily because it can be held to your soil. However, there's lots of organisms in your soil that will take this ammonium, okay, and convert it to nitrates, right? That's done by bacteria. And that just happens naturally in the soil, especially if you have really healthy, biologically active soil. So once that ammonium is converted to nitrates, there's a potential for these nitrates to be lost to leaching. You see there's a negative, sorry, I keep losing my mouse here. You see there's a negative symbol here, okay? Your soil has a positive charge. Nitrate has a negative, or I'm sorry, your soil has a negative charge. Nitrates have a negative charge, okay? They don't attract each other, they repel. So we lose a lot of nitrogen to leaching because your soil can't hold on to it. So if we get a lot of rain, essentially we'll see a lot of loss of nitrates. If you apply too much fertilizer early and the plants can't take it all up as fast as you're putting it on, then you'll also likely lose the nitrates to leaching, and you can also lose them to denitrification, okay? All right. So what we highly recommend with nitrogen is to do split applications, and it really depends what you're set up for, what your system is, but you at least want to try for 2 applications, usually one around kind of the end of May. For us anyway, it'll be end of May to early June, and then another one in mid-May to end of June. You can put on 3 applications if you like. If you're putting on 150 pounds of nitrogen, you can put 50 pounds on, now, mid-June and end of June, and that will minimize chances of nutrient losses, okay? Some people still add small applications of nitrogen after flowering to keep the plant healthy and going. I haven't seen a lot of research data to support that, but that is, pretty common practice out west, especially with long season varieties that are harvested later, like in September or end of September, okay? So again, when you're fertilizing your hop yard, you can either broadcast the fertilizer, you can put it through your drip line or fertigation, or a combination of both, right? So a lot of people ask me this, and I'll try to cover this quickly. I know I'm running out of time. We only fertilize the hop growing area, okay? So we actually figure out what's the area to be fertilized, which is this bed area here. So we side dress these hops. We go along here and side dress them. Okay, we're not fertilizing all the drive rows. We're not just broadcasting fertilizer everywhere. What we're doing is we're just fertilizing this real estate right here. And that's 4 feet wide by 200 feet long. So each one of our rows is about 800 square feet. And we calculate our fertilizer rate based on that square footage. So for each row, we're actually only applying 2.9 pounds of nitrogen, okay, per row. So that's how we figure out our fertility amendments. If you're broadcasting the whole area, then you would figure it out likely on a per acre basis, okay? If you're using fertigation, you want to be careful not to apply too much nitrogen using a fertigation system, because you can over apply. You can apply too much salt and hurt the plant. So generally what we recommend are really small doses of N fertilizers throughout the entire growing season. I've heard of anything from 1 pound per day to 3 pounds per day of nitrogen per acre. And we were roughly doing 3 pounds per week, okay? So you can see how you can really dial this in and apply small amounts of fertilizer, you know, daily, weekly, through your fertigation system, okay? So again, you can broadcast it on the field, you can apply it through a fertigation system, or you can do both. And we actually do both up at the research farm. Let's go and switch over to phosphorus and potassium and magnesium, because again, we don't really want to forget about these nutrients. We focus a lot on nitrogen because that's, it's really the hardest to manage because it's so vulnerable to loss, but it's also the nutrient that the hops need the most of. Okay, but they also need phosphorus and potassium and magnesium as well. So most soil tests provide you with these different ranges, so low, medium, optimum, high, very high. If you have a soil test that is in the optimum range for all the nutrients, I would say that you don't necessarily need to apply more phosphorus, potassium, or magnesium, okay? What optimum means is that the chances of seeing a crop response from adding more fertilizer is pretty minimum, okay? If your soil test is low, you need to be adding phosphorus and potassium and magnesium, okay? Low means if you add these nutrients, you're going to see a crop response. Your crop is probably limited in yield because it doesn't have enough phosphorus, potassium, or magnesium. If your soil test is in the medium range, then again, you'll likely see a crop response from adding fertilizer. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if your soil test is high or very high, you do not need to add more phosphorus, more potassium, more magnesium. You have plenty there, all right? Okay, so hops crop roughly needs anywhere between no phosphorus, depending on the soil test, up to about 80 pounds, likely maximum application rate. And again, what you put on the field will really depend on what your soil test says. So if it's very high, you don't need anything. If it's low, then you'll need, you know, probably a maximum of about 80 pounds of phosphorus per acre, okay? We add phosphorus in the beginning of the season, okay, and we broadcast that with the nitrogen and the potassium that's needed. Okay. All right, so potassium, same thing. You will need anywhere from nothing if your soil tests are high to very high, to maybe upwards, you know, to 100, 150, 160 pounds of potassium, depending on your soil test. All right, so you can see if you have a low soil test, it might call for 120 pounds of potassium. My recommendation would be to split that application up and put half on with your first application of nitrogen and half on your second application of nitrogen. Boron and zinc, and again, are common deficiencies in the Northeast. We've been putting on 1 to 2 pounds per acre of boron if the levels are low to our hop yard, and the same thing with zinc. If we have low levels of zinc, we're putting on 2 to 4 pounds per acre. That's not very much fertilizer to apply to an entire acre, so you can put that through your drip line, or you can also blend it in with your nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus. All right, so let's just quickly lastly go through organic sources of nutrients. You know, these are slow release, and that's the point I want to make with these. So vines and leaves return to the field in the form of compost, or if you're adding animal manure, or composted animal manure, and most organic bagged fertilizers, okay, they're organic matter. They're slow release, which means that it will take time for them to break down and release nitrogen. So if you're fertilizing a field with an organic animal-based manure or even vegetable-based manure, you need to plan on that decomposition time, okay? So it's not like adding a synthetic fertilizer. When you add urea or ammonium sulfate or sodium nitrate, those fertilizer sources are 100% plant available. The plant can access those nutrients immediately. When you put on a compost, it can take months, depending on the compost, to break down into plant available forms of nitrogen. So if you're putting on compost in the middle of June, hoping for that to supply you your entire nitrogen needs for your hop crop, you're going to be disappointed, because it's going to take 30 to 60 days for that nutrient source to release enough nitrogen to support the crop, okay? So if you need help with these calculations, please let me know, because I think it can be very misleading to people who see, you know, an organic fertilizer source that says it's 5% nitrogen. Well, it may be 5% nitrogen, but all of that nitrogen isn't plant available immediately, all right? So I just wanted to make that point for folks. Oh, I got to wrap this up. Organic matter, we haven't done a lot of work on this in hops, but organic matter is important, and I think you need to be adding organic sources of nutrients to your hop yard. I think there's a lot of benefit to them, and that has been shown in the research, especially in Europe. All right, if you're making compost at home or applying manure, have it tested so you know what's in it. Okay, compost manures, they're slow release. They can release nutrients over a pretty long period of time, and it relies on microbes to break them down to release nutrients. So it's slow, and it's not always right when we want it, right? Here's just different nutrient values from different manure sources. Okay, so just quickly, here's solid dairy manure, and you can see that it has 10 pounds right here of nitrogen per ton. So you need to put on like at least 10 tons to get only half of the nitrogen that you need to grow hops. So just keep that in mind. It's important if you're putting nutrients on your hop yard, you know what's in them and how fast they're going to break down. So I want to wrap this up because I want to leave some time for questions. And I would invite you to send me emails, visit our website as well to get more information on hop fertility. So I'll end it there and take a few questions. I went over time. I'm sorry.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So just as a reminder to pose a question, you're just going to find the question box on the right-hand side of your screen in the control panel. You'll just type your questions in and hit return. If you're on a mobile device, you'll just hit the question mark to open that up. And we will be taking a few questions from Heather, but she does have to leave in a few minutes. So if we could launch right into those, that would be great. We'll just allow a few seconds for any questions.
Well, it's definitely it's a lot of information, and especially if you're not familiar with soils, you know, it's a lot to cover in a very short webinar. So people are.
So Heather, what signs or conditions indicate the start of nitrogen uptake?
Okay, so you know, essentially the vegetative growth period of the plant, right? So when the plants are small, so right now people are starting to train their plants. This is really the start of when those plants are going to put on a lot of growth, right? So water, nutrients, and temperature will influence how fast they grow. So right now is really the start, right? I would say the very first part of June is when things kick off, and I think everybody has seen those hop plants jump almost a foot a day. When that starts happening, that's the rapid uptake period. They need to have all those pieces in place.
Great. What are your thoughts on foliar nitrogen?
I'm not a big you know, we have used some compost teas and things like that. The thing I worry about a little bit with adding more water to the surface of the plants is that we already have a lot of moisture in the Northeast, and I'm not sure how it would influence disease pressure like downy mildew. So right now I think the primary way is through fertigation and broadcast. But if you had to get into a rescue mission where you really needed to help those hops, that's usually when we recommend foliar fertilization.
Great. And
severe.
And speaking of fertigation, do you have any recommendations on organic fertigation products or materials?
Yeah, so we've used, we have fertigated the past few years with sodium nitrate actually, and we've also used a soybean meal type product as well. I'm not sure, the soybean meal product is pretty expensive, and I can send whoever this is, send me an email, or Deb, we can send you the exact product. But I'm not sure about availability, how fast it breaks down. So that's why I stopped using it, because I felt like I was using a lot and not getting what I needed right away.
Okay, so would you recommend a petiole test, and if so, at what point during the season?
We have done petiole tests, and I think we're still trying to gauge the interpretation of those. So that's what I'll say. I think it's been hard for us to interpret the results at this point. There are consultants that use petiole testing out in the Pacific Northwest, and they've used that for many years. There is a little bit of information from Oregon State, but again, we don't have a really good interpretation of those in the Northeast yet. So I'm going to err on saying I haven't been recommending it.
Okay, and this is an off-topic question, but what distance do rhizomes travel?
Well, the reason there's a 3-foot recommendation is because it's thought that the rooting depth of hops is 3 feet or more. But the distance the rhizomes travel across, the surface of the ground. If your yard's been in a while, most people can attest that they can travel quite far. They intermingle. We've seen ours travel 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet.
Okay, great. I know we're sort of running out of time for you, Heather. I know you have to get off.
I can take another couple questions.
Yeah, it looks like the question is that, about your presentation and whether that's going to be made available, and I can say it will be. So we can provide the the slides, the PDF of the slides, and of course this is being recorded, so we'll be able to share this afterwards. So yeah.
And we do have on the website, on our website, we do have a hop fertility information sheet as well.
Yep, and I just popped in the chat for you all, fertility guidelines. It's a nice little article that we have on our website, so there's a direct link there.
Yeah, and I would say if you're interested in fertigating and figuring out how to set up dilution rates, you know, that's a whole nother webinar. But there are some good fact sheets online, and we can get those posted as well that walk you through that.
Excellent. Well, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue at this point, Heather, so.
Great.
All righty.
Let Scott take over.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And good luck. Heather's on the Hill talking about with our elected officials about the importance of this type of research. So good luck with that, Heather.
Thank you.
We're going to transition over to Scott. And while we do that, I'm just going to ask you a couple of quick questions. So they're going to pop up on your computer. So the first one that we have is, did you learn anything new today? And if you could just select one of those responses, that would be great. And we're just going to go through these fairly quickly. Great. Excellent. All right, and we have just one more quick question, which is, here we go. Based on what you learned today, will you start or change a nutrient management or fertility practice? So if you could click on one of those results, or those responses, excuse me, that would be awesome. Great. Alrighty, and now I'm going to just turn it over to Scott Lewins.
Thank you, Deb.
Good, yeah. So if you could just share your screen, Scott, that would be great.
And
let's see.
Show screen.
There we go. Yep.
Can you guys see me? Perfect.
Yep.
Well, I just wanted to take this time at the end of our Hops Power Hour to share some of the preliminary results of our first goScout survey, which coincidentally is still open for those of you who have been dying to share the results of your scouting but haven't had a chance to. Excuse me. I know a few of you had contacted me and let me know that you'd be a little bit behind on this. So this will remain open. This survey will remain open, and so even though I might not be sharing what you submit, I can share what everybody else has. Excuse me for a second. My computer.
I think you're just going to click on the screen and then you can advance it.
Oh,
there you go.
So really quickly, you guys who had completed the survey shared some information about what's happening in your yards. The first question that we had asked is about how tall are your hops so far, and of course we have some geographic variation. We've got folks out in Ohio all the way up to here in New England. So generally most people are looking at about 1 to 3 feet tall at the point that they completed the survey. The lowest was about half a foot, 6 inches, and the tallest was about 6 feet. So again, a little bit of variation based on when you've trained and where you're located. That brings in the idea of training. About half of the respondents at the time of completing the survey had already trained. Most folks had about the 11th of May or later started their training. Those of you who have trained, that is. Again, right around mid-May was when training began. Obviously that, again, depends a lot on where you're located, but also a number of you noted that that training is very variety specific. So some varieties obviously would train sooner than others. We did ask about your plans for crowning, whether you have or plan to use crowning. A number of you who responded said that you were not planning or have not crowned. But those of you that did crown, mechanical was the #1 response. And in fact, there's one person who was looking at a combination of both mechanical and flame. In terms of downy mildew in your yards, there was, again, a large variety of responses, mostly based on the size of your yards. So it seems like, even though we have a lot of rain this season, most folks were actually looking at very little to no downy mildew. About half of the respondents had 0% of the plants scouted showing downy mildew spikes. So that's good, again, even with the rainy weather that we've been having. And in fact, most people that had downy mildew was showing less than 10% of the number of plants that they scouted showing downy mildew signs. There were a few folks who were over 20% of the plants showing downy mildew. If we look at the number of basal spikes on each plant, again, a number of you had said no downy mildew whatsoever, so obviously those folks didn't have any basal spikes, but even those folks who did see spikes were generally fewer than 8. We did have one grower with quite a few more spikes per plant, but again, most folks either had 0 or if they saw any, just a few spikes per plant. In terms of when those spikes first appeared, roughly half of the folks who saw those said about mid-May. A couple of folks said they saw some signs in April. Again, that variation is going to be largely driven by where you're located. And obviously if you're in a warmer climate, you're going to see those signs earlier in the season. So if you do see spikes, downy mildew symptoms in your yard, you're generally going to see them patchy. That makes sense. The pathogen is spread throughout the yard by spores, and so you're not going to see it either uniformly, generally not see it uniformly, or just sort of randomly, but in patches, areas of lots of downy mildew, and then other areas that might be a little bit drier or might have more airflow with far fewer spikes. So if you do see spikes, what are you guys planning on doing with them? A large majority of folks are mechanically removing those spikes. Some folks removing them by hand. I would put that in the category of mechanical pruning, using just hand clippers if you're on a smaller scale. Some folks looking into chemical pruning, or the large other category. Most of those folks are a combination of more than one of those, so mechanical and flame. And then there's also a number of you who indicated that you would be using fungicides, which again is, as David mentioned last time around, a good strategy. There's no way to cure, but fungicides as a preventative to keep downy transmission down is certainly recommended. Which gets to the last piece here, is as a result of this goScouting, what have you or planning to do? And again, a number of you have indicated that you will be using any number of different fungicide applications. I want to just point out that in the email invitation to fill out the goScout survey, we included a link to an article written a couple of years ago about downy mildew, and in there's a table at the end that I believe is as of 2012, fungicides registered in Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts. So if you haven't looked at that table, a number of you indicated you would like more information about fungicide applications. So please, again, take a look at that that publication. It's on our website, as well as, again, being shared with you in that email invitation. The final thing that I'd like to do is, again, you had an opportunity to share with us information that you would like while taking that survey. And so I'll just go through a few of those things. Being an entomologist, of course, the most important piece of information that someone asked was that they had apparently seen some pictures of insect eggs on the underside of leaves. And so any pictures that you take, whether it's of insects or not, feel free to share those with us if you have questions. A number of you have sent in pictures wanting to know whether or not they were downy mildew, and we're happy to answer questions over email. Again, please share those pictures. On the topic of pictures, also you had asked about, a number of you asked about more pictures of downy mildew, in particular comparing downy mildew and other symptoms that are similar. And so what we can do is we'll put together some images and post those of symptoms that are commonly misidentified as downy mildew. It can be water stress. Cold stress can also sometimes manifest similarly to downy mildew. So again, we'll put those together and post those. Again, a number of you asked about fungicides, and so again, I'll point you to the table that's at the end of that publication. At this point, I just want to point out that our next Hops Power Hour, June 26th, will be again at noon, and the focus of that will be potato leafhoppers, and we'll have Lily Calderwood, formerly of the Vermont Hops Project, and now with Cornell Cooperative Extension. And then the other thing I want to remind you is we will be doing these goScouts every 2 weeks. The current goScout will remain open, and then next week we'll send you an invitation for the next goScouting opportunity. We'll focus on fertility, but talk about continued scouting and those things that you guys are planning on doing. With that, if you have questions, we're happy to entertain those at this point.
Great, thank you, Scout. Yeah, we have just 2 minutes left for today's Power Hour. And as if you want to type in a question or two, that would be great. I just want to remind folks that our Power Hours are, as Scott said, our next one's coming up June 26th and at noon, and that's noon Eastern time. I know some folks have gotten some reminders that it's Central, but we'll always have our webinars at noon Eastern. Scott, there's a question about UVM and if we've trained yet.
We have only begun to train. Our target for training is usually towards the end of May. So some of our early varieties we've begun to train, but not all of them.
Great. It does.
And I will remind you guys that we are on the Canadian border, so we may be a little bit behind some of the other folks that are participating.
Great. Do you feel like the plants are ahead from last year? Do you have a sense of that?
I can't answer that question for sure. My gut feeling is that yeah, last year was a little bit cooler, and even though we've had quite a bit of rain, it does seem like it's slightly ahead of last year. Again, last year being a bit cooler for us.
Great. So we are at 1 o'clock, and I want to be mindful of time. So any questions, please do email Scott and or Heather. We're happy to take your questions at any time, including photos. We'll see you next time in June 26th with Lily, and we'll be following up with you with some resources, including the recording of this webinar. So with that, thank you, Scott, and we'll hope that you have a great season.
And thank you all.
And we'll see you next time. Okay.